Good morning and welcome to the first coffee break discussion of Saturday at the Riga conference. And let me introduce to you first Maria Logan, who is a lawyer by training, born in what then was the Soviet Union. You work for Open Russia, the organization set up by Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and as a lawyer you were very much involved, I know, in his final release from prison. My name is Uffe Ellemann-Jensen. I'm a former foreign minister of Denmark, and after leaving politics I've been very active in the Baltic Development Forum and other institutions that has to do with cooperation in the Baltic Sea region. And we are going to discuss, while sipping our scalding hot coffee, we're going to discuss the sanctions regime. Are the sanctions in a way working against their purpose, as some people claim? What are the whole importance of the sanctions? I, for one, have always believed that sanctions, economic sanctions, is usually a stupid thing, and also a dangerous thing, because once you have closed the door, the big question is, when do you open that door again without sending the wrong signals? And I think we had a terrible lesson after Georgia, where Sarkozy, who was then in charge as French president of the European Council, he created, together with, I think it was Medvedev at the time, and Putin, he created a ceasefire that was broken immediately by Russia, and some sanctions were introduced. Among others, council meetings in NATO were closed. That lasted 1 year, and they still broke the ceasefire agreements. And then the Europeans came crawling back. The French even made an agreement with the Russians to build Mistral carriers to their navy. And the Americans tried this awful reset operation, where Hillary Clinton came in with this reset button that was poorly translated, and gave Lavrov a good opportunity to make jokes about that. And where I remember my good friend Thomas Ilves, president of Estonia, he said, well, you may reset a computer, but that does not erase the memory, which was a good point about that. So my fear is that after Putin probably was very surprised that the Europeans could agree upon sanctions, then he is now probably just sitting and waiting. When are they going to give it up? And signals are many that the European front is weakening. Only a week ago, the German deputy chancellor, Sigmar Gabriel, of all people, jumped out of the closet as a Putin versteher and went to Moscow and said, oh, I don't know what's wrong between you and us, as though he had forgotten about Crimea. So my fear is that the Russians are now just waiting for the the weak Europeans to give up. How do you look at sanctions from your seat?
I think sanctions can be very effective if they're really thought through, carefully thought through, and if they can be sustainable long-term or at least mid-term. I think from the very beginning our position's been that sanctions, again, can be effective only if they can be sustainable for long-term and mid-term. What we're seeing now is that I think many agree on this, and many experts, that sanctions do have effect, or they are showing signs of having effect. And we're talking about direct effect and indirect effect of sanctions. So we if we look at the sanctions, I mean, we know there are two types of sanctions. There are individual sanctions that were introduced primarily after the, after the annexation of Crimea, and there are sectorial sanctions. So if we take the individual sanctions, and if you take the list of individuals from Russian side, I think they're working very well. I think the people who've been put on the list, I mean, they are concerned about their inability to travel to Europe, to United States. Most of them regularly travel to Europe, but now they cannot. Their sort of indirect effect of those sanctions that they're struggling, these people, with properties they have outside of Russia. Children can know or have difficulties going to schools outside of Russia. So they do have effect, and there's tensions. We can see there's some signs of tensions within the elite or within the circle around President Putin, showing that they don't like what's happening. So if you look at the sectorial sanctions, there's
let's stick to those sanctions for a while, because I certainly agree with you that keeping the oligarchs away from their palaces at the Mediterranean and the fancy schools in England where they put their children, that's a great thing. On top of that, you could perhaps also lift the lid on the bag of knowledge you have on how much money Putin has got stashed away and where. That would really be a fine thing. But some of those persons who are on lists are persons you really needed to talk to. You heard that general yesterday saying, well, it's a good thing to have military people from each side speak to each other because, as Churchill said, jaw is better than war. So, and then they, of course, made counter lists. I'm very disappointed that I'm not yet on one of those lists, because you eagerly looked at it. It has not been made public. Some of my colleagues in Denmark is on the list, and they look down their nose on me. Why you're not on your list? You're probably too old and uninteresting. So, but in a way, this stops a dialogue that gives us a possibility to deliver the messages. Don't you fear that this could be a side effect of starting to make sanctions on people's movement?
I think if you talk about the official dialogue, if you talk about people who currently have posts, official posts within Russian government, involved in sort of diplomatic channels and dialogue, I think there are exceptions to the rule. I mean, there's always exceptions to the rule. And I think there is a possibility for them to continue that dialogue if they want to. The only caveat to that is that they do have to be part or travel as part of that dialogue, as part of those diplomatic channels. There is another issue with those sanctions, is that we've also seen over the past almost 2 years since the sanctions were implemented that some individuals who have nothing to do with official dialogue or diplomacy that do receive certain privileges or certain exceptions. I mean, the famous case of the Russian singer Kobzon, who was able to travel to Italy, I believe, for humanitarian purposes. And it received a lot of criticism within Russia, that how come a person like Kobzon receives preferential treatment. If you remember, President Putin personally requested permission for Kobzon to travel, even though he was on the individual sanction list, to travel for medical treatment. And I believe he received sort of the free passage to Italy. I think he was treated at the end in Germany, but I wouldn't speculate on this. So I think it's important that the sanctions, individual sanctions, because they do have effect in Russia, that they are actually consistently implemented and enforced. Because if there are preferences and there are exceptions that are not sort of legitimate exceptions, I think everyone is seeing that the European Union or United States are making exceptions, and they are not serious about those sanctions.
Now, let's turn to the economic sanctions. Well, for obvious reasons, there are sanctions on military hardware, etc. And it was at the very last moment the Russians didn't get those Mistral ships out of Cherbourg or wherever they were built. Looks as though the Egyptians are buying them now, probably by Saudi money. But leave that. But the economic sanctions. It seems as though the sanctions that are hitting hardest are the sanctions that Putin introduced as a counter-sanction. It really hits the Russian people on the prices of foodstuff, etc. Inflation has raised up. It does not hit the producers in Europe as much as he probably wanted it to, but still, if you talk to a Russian consumer today, he and she would probably believe that these sanctions were introduced by us, by the West, against them. And if you talk to the Danish farmer who suddenly sees the price of his pigs go down, he also believes that we did it. So haven't we given a weapon away? Have we been smart enough to stand up against the propaganda war that we are also facing there?
Well, I think the question of Russian propaganda and its effectiveness, I mean, I think it's a separate question for discussion. It will take us an hour to talk about this. And I think there are some measures on the way introduced here in the European Union, and the Americans are thinking the same way as to how to counter that and how to rebalance the information that's going, that is spreading within the Russian language community inside Russia and outside of Russia. But talking about sanctions, I think you're right. Kremlin propaganda is very effective. I think majority of Russians, according to recent polls, view European Union and policies in the United States, policies vis-a-vis Russia as hostile. I think about 82% of Russian people think that Europe and United States are hostile to Russia, and about 55 of those respondents, according to those polls, attribute that hostility to sanctions introduced by the West against Russia. I think, again, this is the effectiveness of Kremlin propaganda. People don't attribute some of the problems in the Russian economy to domestic issues. And also to the counter-sanctions that President Putin introduced against the agricultural sector of the European Union and the Western agricultural sector. So if you actually look at Russian economy today, you'll see that Russian economy suffers from several major problems. I mean, reduction of oil prices, decrease of oil prices, ruble devaluation, and obviously sanctions. There is a very poor investment climate, which is evidenced by the significant outflows of capital out of Russia. I think for 2015, the estimate is about $113 billion outflow. The FDI reduced significantly, and I think it is very hard to determine what part of those problems should be attributed to the Western sectorial sanctions. I think the European Commission recently talked about the downgrade of Russia's GDP by 1%, which they attribute to the Western sanctions. And Russia's GDP, the expectation is Russian GDP will be down by about between 2 and 3% this year. So there is an impact of sanctions on Russian economy, though it's still not clear how the sanctions really affect Russian economy or Russian economy vis-a-vis other problems.
Now, the sanctions are up for renewal in Europe in January. And if you look at the mood in some European countries, they want to get rid of the sanctions. It's as though many people have forgotten why the sanctions were introduced. And perhaps we should once in a while remind each other that, well, rules were broken, one-sided. And I, for one, I spent most of my life in politics in working hard for the agreements that ended the Cold War, that gave us what we then optimistically called a new world order. The Helsinki Final Agreement, Copenhagen Document, Paris Charter, etc. And Putin just put all that down, and people are tending to forgetting that now. You hear people in Europe talking about, well, Crimea wasn't Crimea Russian. originally? Wasn't it Khrushchev who, in a drunken hour, gave it away? And the Putin versteher, they grow everywhere. So what kind of expectations do you have that the Europeans will stay up and prolong the sanctions in January when it comes up again?
Well, if we go back to 2014 when sanctions were introduced, the goal behind the sanctions was to deter the behavior, the illegal behavior of President Putin in the international stage, in Ukraine. And the recent report by CISS suggests that, which they analyzed the impact of sanctions. It's an October report. They say that while the sanctions are not deterring Putin from actions in Ukraine, I mean, we see violations of Minsk II. But however, the West, in terms of increasing its leverage in negotiation positions with Russia, I think we believe that sanctions and the sanctions are working in that sense. So you're absolutely right. We hear more and more, including the European Commission recently said that perhaps we should look again into the dialogue with Russia. I mean, there is sort of a feeling that, perhaps 2016, when the sanctions have to be renewed on the European side, the European Union has to look again and perhaps lift some of the sanctions, if not all of the sanctions, because there is expectation that Minsk will be implemented at some point, which I actually have a lot of doubts about that. So there is sentiment, and I think it's more political than economical sentiment that sanctions should not be extended. If you look at the economic impact on Europe, from these sanctions and from the counter-sanctions introduced by Putin, I think I agree with many experts that the impact is still quite limited. If you look at the decrease in trade between Europe and Russia, I mean, it's by 30%. And you look, for example, at the trade of Russia with China, it's also expected to be decreased by 30%. So I wouldn't agree with the argument that the West is losing to the East.
I saw a paper you wrote recently where you gave a good example of Polish agriculture.
Yes. Well, if you look at we know that Poland was affected very hard at the beginning by the countermeasures introduced by President Putin in the agricultural sector. But if you look at the numbers in 2014 and 2015 for the first 2 quarters, I think actually its exports of agricultural products have increased. Yeah. I think in 2014 by 7%, and the expectation this year is going to be by about 6%. So I think there's been a really big push for geographical reorientation of trade, both on the side of the European Union and on the side of Russia as well. Though I think on the Russian side, this reorientation towards East is sort of a wishful thinking at the moment. Yeah.
Well, but say if in January some people around in Europe succeed in saying, well, Minsk II is almost fulfilled. So let's try to ease things. What kind of signal would that be to Putin? Wouldn't he just relax and say, well, I told you, it's a paper tiger. They're doing the same stuff now that they did after Georgia. They cannot stand on. All we have to do is stand tall. Isn't that a risk?
I think if the West is sending signals, which I think the West does send signals to Putin that implement Minsk II, and sanctions will go away, or at least some sanctions will go away. I think if that's the signal, then almost implementations of Minsk agreement doesn't equate to implementation of Minsk. And for Putin and his circle, it will signify only that the West is weak again, and signing shows weakness. So again, that goes back to the goal of the sanctions. If you want to have leverage in negotiations, if you want to talk to Russia from the position of strength, is that the right signal to send? And again, as always, we've always been saying that these sanctions, they will have positive effect only if they can be sustained long-term or mid-term. If they are repealed next year, it's too early. It basically will nullify the positive effect of sanctions in the long term, in the long term or mid-term. So I think it's very important that the West consistently enforce the sanctions that's been in place and keep the sanctions that can be sustainable long-term or mid-term. Because again, I think the impact, economic impact, is still limited. So we're really talking about political will. So if talking about political will, I think, in my opinion, the sanctions should stay, and because they have effect on sort of the regime or Putin's regime's ability financially to maneuver and sustain its policies long term. So if they are repealed again, then everything goes back to the beginning. So what was the point of introducing those sanctions in the first place?
Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm basically against that kind of sanctions. But I agree with you. Once they have been introduced, you have to stick to them. Instead of sending wrong messages, perhaps we could also start thinking a little more about what kind of sanctions works. And I cannot but think back to the days of the Cold War when we had the COCOM regime, where you had this coordinating committee looking at strategic sanctions in order to keep what was then the Soviet Union away from benefiting from buying strategic stuff from us. Should we introduce that?
I think it is. I'm glad you brought it in, because I think certainly the experiences of the Cold War era should be reviewed and studied again. And I think the experiences of COCOM were very valuable, and I think they remain valuable today, because we're talking about targeted sanctions. So sometimes experts refer to them as smart sanctions, which would reduce again the financial maneuvering of the regime. You know, if you target specific, let's say, product, strategic product, that is essential for, let's say, essential in the in strategic sectors in Russia, whether it's nuclear, whether it's military operations, and if you select that product and ban that product, then the regime has to basically spend a lot of money. If we're talking about capital expenditures in producing that product within Russia. So if they have to spend the money that they have, which they don't have, and we know that the reserves are going to be run out, Russia will run out of its reserves by around 2018, late 2017. So you really chip out from the reserves the money that Russia needs to basically sustain inside Russia, domestically sustain and pay wages and pensions, etc. So you're limiting its maneuvering and limiting its abilities to go on military adventures outside of Russia.
Well, but if something like COCOM should be reintroduced, it's about high time. And it's also about high time that we end our conversation and get back downstairs, where the Riga conference will reconvene in about 5 minutes' time. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you very much.
It was very interesting to hear your thoughts about this. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.